Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Inshallah, in this session, which is probably going to be shorter than most, bi'ithnillah, our intention is just to complete this fourth bab, in which Ibn Juzayy rahmatullah alayhi is taking us through the sciences and the disciplines and fields of knowledge which are connected with tafsir, right? So as he says, connected with the study of the Quran, but central to that is tafsir. So as we are studying his book in tafsir, we are going to be encountering things which touch on these various sciences, right? So if we go back to review what we have talked on so far, there was tafsir itself and some aspects of the definition of it, and some very useful insight into the nature of difference of opinion in tafsir, right? So sometimes it is genuine difference in substance, and sometimes it is difference in expression. Now, the qira'at was mentioned second, and we spoke a little bit about it, and we're going to speak again once we come to his separate bab on that, inshallah. But on a practical level, qira'at is something that we encounter as we are reading through the tafsir of Ibn Juzayy. Not all the time, and not all the qira'at are mentioned, but especially those that do have an impact on meaning, and those things which help to shine a light on different dimensions of the ayah, right? Number 3 is ahkam al-Quran. So this is you know, if you like, it's a kind of specific method of reading the Quran, right? So when you're looking at the Quran from the lens of deriving ahkam, this is a kind of what you could call a fiqhi reading of the Quran. And you could also see collections of ahkam al-Quran, such as, you know, Muqatil bin Sulaiman, for example, who is the author of the earliest extant tafsir of the Quran, you know, full tafsir. He also has a book which is tafsir of 500 ayat. In fact, it's actually called that, tafsiru khamsi mi'ati ayah. So he has a tafsir of 500 ayat, which is specifically around what are known as ayat al-ahkam. And that's, you know, that could be linked to the reason why we still talk about Ibn Juzayy is saying here that there are around 500 ayahs which are pertinent to ahkam. Now, there are plenty of things in the Quran, plenty of ayat which don't look like ayat of ahkam, but there could still be ahkam pertaining to them, right? Even fiqhi ahkam, or of course other types of ahkam, right? Because rulings could you know, be a slightly broader concept. But here we're talking about things which have a practical dimension, such as halal and haram, such as wajib, and all the way down to haram, of course. So it could be more than 500, as he's indicating, but not necessarily meaning that for the reason that I just said, that, you know, there could be broader concept of ahkam, and there could be more subtle ahkam that are withdrawn from things that really don't look like ayat al-ahkam, right? They don't seem to be directly providing a ruling, right? So the methods used in that, we're going to encounter just below something called usul al-fiqh. Usul al-fiqh are usul for reading the source texts and for dealing with the sources of law in Islam. And one of those sources, and the primary, and, you know, the precedence of all sources, of course, goes to the Quran. So usul al-fiqh contains within it rules for reading the Quran in a fiqhi way, right? Usul al-fiqh gives you rules for reading the Quran for the purpose of deriving ahkam from it. And that's a point that we'll return to when we look at the mention of usul al-fiqh. So then he talked about naskh, and again, that's something that we'll come back to, because he has got a chapter on naskh, a bab on naskh, and we will say some more things about it, about some you know, tendencies to maximize the amount of naskh in the Quran and then attempts to minimize the amount of naskh in the Quran, or indeed the presence of skepticism about naskh altogether, or denial of the existence of naskh. We'll talk about this phenomenon in due course, inshallah. And then finally we talked about hadith, and he very nicely has divided the point about the importance of hadith into two things. One is a hadith in general, which give you a context, and they might give you specific asbab al-nuzul and help you to identify when things were revealed, and therefore chronology, which then helps you to understand what needs to be done in terms of naskh, and possibly other reasons that we want to know the context, and to avoid taking something that was more specific and thinking that it's just very broad as the word appears, right? So there is obviously a lot more detail that is to be studied about that, how asbab al-nuzul operate and so on. And in terms of general hadiths from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then I sort of touched on, but I don't think I elaborated on how we have to assess hadiths. First of all, by the way, the word hadith in the use of the muhaddithin is broader than just marfu' ahadith, right? Things that are raised, as it were, and their isnad is raised back to the Prophet ﷺ, but the word hadith could be broader than that, hadith from the Sahaba, hadith from the Tabi'een as well. But then the most important part of what we're talking about here is hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ, things which are marfu' to him. And then beyond that, you've also got things that the Sahaba might have said, which are considered marfu' hukman, right? So they are treated as if they are marfu', as if they came from the Prophet ﷺ, even though they may not have said so explicitly. But you get that from just by looking at the factors surrounding that report, right? So if one of the Sahaba is saying something and it just doesn't sound like something he would have just, or she would have just said from mere opinion, right? It was something, a detail about a verse on the akhirah, right? And what happens on the day of judgment. They wouldn't sit there and just make stuff up, right? So they had to get it from somewhere. So the first assumption, of course, would be they would hear those things from the Prophet ﷺ. Then again, it's possible that they pick these things up from other people. So if it's known that a particular Sahabi had the practice of discussing with and taking things from the people of the book, or the converts of the people of the book, then that might be that Sahaba's reports in that regard might be considered not marfu' hukman, right? They could still be useful or interesting, but not assumed to be coming from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Anyway, so that's a little bit about hadith. And one more thing we could say is that we look for the strength, we look for the relevance, and we look for the impact, right? So by strength, I mean, first of all, do we, just give me a moment. The strength in terms of, okay, if a hadith is reported from the Prophet ﷺ, is that something which is sahih or hasan, right? Therefore, it has its usability, right? Is it something that's weaker than that? Well, then it can't be used in the same way. It might still have a use. It might still have some relevance, but not on the level of a hadith that can be applied comfortably, right? Which is a sahih hadith or a hasan hadith indeed. But there's plenty of discussion about that in the hadith courses. But what I'm getting at here is, beyond establishing did the Prophet ﷺ say it, we also want to know how relevant is it to the understanding of the ayah, right? So is it a direct explanation of the ayah, or is it rather something that he said or did which scholars or even the Sahaba themselves might have linked to and related to the ayah? In that regard, I mean, this even can be said about sabab nuzul, right? So in sabab nuzul, a lot of times the Sahaba themselves would say, nazalat, this ayah, nazalat fi kada wa kada, right? And the thing that they say it was revealed concerning might not be them reporting an incident that took place in which something happened and then the ayah came and, on that occasion. Sometimes they use that expression, as a number of scholars have noted, in a sort of looser way to say it was revealed concerning this type of thing, right? So this is the topic that it's about. So they might not have meant that it was that particular occasion that they are mentioning or describing, right? So relevance is something that has to be investigated. How much does this hadith relate to this ayah? The muhaddithin may have taken the ayah, the muhaddithin may have taken the statement of the Prophet ﷺ and placed it in their bab of tafsir of a particular ayah. And that could be their ijtihad, right? It could be their understanding that this hadith is related to or relevant to this ayah. It's different from saying that the Prophet ﷺ was explaining the ayah when he said what he said, right? So on some occasions that happens. But it is well known that the number of hadith that we have that are directly tafsir from the Prophet ﷺ are vanishingly small, right? So there's a book which is called the Tafsir al-Nabawi, a modern book, comes in 2 volumes. And the author of that book has attempted to gather everything from the hadith, I think from the 9 books. He has sought to gather everything that is tafsirun sarih, right? So explicitly tafsir. And from that, in that he has included everything, whether it be sahih, da'if, whatever. In the end, he has gathered 318 hadiths, right? So that's not a great deal. That's why most of the scholars have not gravitated towards what Ibn Taymiyyah said. Ibn Taymiyyah rahmatullah alayhi has stated in some different wordings, so you can understand from him that the Prophet ﷺ has explained all of the Quran to his companions, or has explained most of the Quran to his companions. Right? So just as he was teaching them the ayah itself, he would teach them the meaning, right, directly. The ahadith that have then trickled down and reached us do not bear that out in reality. So we would understand, in fact, that the Sahaba, for the most part, understood things without having to receive a direct explanation. And sometimes when they needed it, such as when they came with a question or with a misunderstanding, the Prophet ﷺ would clear that up for them. And then these things would be reported and recorded as ahadith. Right, so let's move on from hadith for now. We come to al-qasas. Although you should flag me up, because I said I was talking about strength, relevance, and impact, right? So the impact is the last thing. The mufassir has to decide, okay, now that I've received this hadith and I take it as strong and relevant, what impact does it have on the understanding of the ayah, right? So do I just quote the hadith and there's nothing more to be said about it? Or is it, for example, a mithal? So we mentioned that before. If the Prophet ﷺ was giving something by way of example, that doesn't mean that restricts the meaning of the ayah to what is mentioned in the hadith, right? So just to show you that there's a third stage: strength, relevance, and impact. Okay. Well, هذا مني, this is just a way that I have for myself categorized the treatment of hadith. Okay. So وأما القصص.
وأما القصص فهو من جملة العلوم التي تضمنها القرآن، فلا بد من تفسيره، إلا أن الضروري منه ما يتوقف التفسير عليه، وما سوى ذلك زيادة مستغنى عنها. وقد أكثر بعض المفسرين من حكاية القصص الصحيح وغير الصحيح، حتى إنهم ذكروا منه ما لا يجوز ذكره مما فيه تقصير بمنصب الأنبياء عليهم السلام، أو حكاية ما يجب تنزيههم عنه. وأما نحن فاقتصرنا في هذا الكتاب من القصص على ما يتوقف التفسير عليه وعلى ما ورد منه في الحديث الصحيح.
Okay, so stories in general من العلوم التي تضمنها القرآن. So this backs up the way I'm reading his use of the word علم القرآن and the way, علوم التنزيل, right? So the qasas is not a science which is then used to understand the Quran. In the first place, he's talking about the qasas being a type of ulum, one of the ulum, which the Quran contains, right? They're part of the sciences which the Quran contains. So even I'm not sure that the word sciences is the way to go here, right? The types of knowledge, right? Ulum is the plural of ilm. Ilm is knowledge. Ulum is types of knowledge, right? فلا بد من تفسيره. So one has to then explain those stories, but and commentary on them is unavoidable. I mean, this la budda sort of sounds like unavoidable, sure, but you make it sound quite negative when you use the word unavoidable, right? He's just been obviously one must comment on them and explain the stories, but there's only a certain extent to which the tafsir actually depends on those elaborations, but has been restricted to that which is necessary. Not but has been restricted. Right, so this sentence is a bit confused. But the only aspect or the only amount, ضروري منه, the amount of it, the portion of it which is ضروري, the amount of such which is necessary is only what the commentary not confines itself to, depends upon. يتوقف عليه is depends upon. Right? Commentary, by the way, is one of the words is used for tafsir and sometimes is appropriate. I sometimes use commentary in a slightly different way. When he's saying that tafsir depends upon it, well, that's the explanation depends upon it. I would rather use here the word exegesis for tafsir. Commentary could be, it sounds like something which could be much more extensive, right? So a commentary upon the Quran could elaborate on things which are not in the core of tafsir. So I think the word commentary could be a broader term. But he wants to say ما يتوقف التفسير عليه. So he's restricting the sense of tafsir here. So I would prefer a word other than commentary. Right? So I'm going to say exegesis, even though elsewhere, we've seen tafsir is translated as commentary here. I'll probably go back and change commentary to exegesis in the first section of this chapter. Anything else is extra and what one can do without. You can simply say, and one can do without it, if you're going to keep that phrase. Or which one can do without. Yeah, that's also another way to put it. Oh, but because extra here is sounding like an adjective, then this doesn't work too well. Some commentators relate a great many stories, both authentic and inauthentic, to the point that they mention that which it is not permitted to mention. They mention such as it is not permitted to mention. I mean, it's still awkward, right? It needs some smoothing. Of that in which there is attribution of a short. Again, I think this is min bayaniya, right? Namely, that in which there's attribution of a shortcoming Okay, so وقد أكثر بعض المفسرين من حكاية القصص الصحيح وغير الصحيح حتى أنهم ذكروا منه ما لا يجوز ذكره مما فيه تقصير بمنصب الأنبياء فيه تقصير بمنصب الأنبياء yeah, so the story itself implies a taqsir on their part. That's the way that the translation is reading. I think you could read it that way. Okay, so there's another way of reading this Arabic text, which is to say the stories themselves are taqsir bimansib al-anbiya. They fall short in respecting the maqam of the prophets as it should be. That in which there's attribution of a shortcoming in the position of the prophets. So I need to have a think whether that's really what he means by this expression. Position rather than position, I would say status, right? And mansib is actually their well, it is their position, isn't it? But their role, right? But status is maybe a bit clearer here. Or telling that which it is a duty to declare them free of. You see how this is very, very, sort of literal and following that in which it is, it's very easy just to take these words and just write it in a more natural way that is much easier to read and understand. Or telling that which it is a duty to declare them free of, i.e. of scandals and slanders. Again, this is an insertion by the translator, should be in square brackets. As a story. There's no need for this as a story. There's a telling as a story. Just simply or relating that which it is a duty to declare them free of. As for us, we can find ourselves in this book. So I'm going to keep the we here. I don't think it's not wrong, because in a way you can see it as he's speaking to us and gathering us, as joining with him in the endeavor of writing this book. فاقتصرنا في هذا الكتاب من القصص على ما يتوقف التفسير عليه. We can find ourselves in this book to stories upon which the commentary depends. Oh, so they got it right here. I find that sometimes the translators got something right and wrong in the same paragraph. And upon those authentic hadith narrated about them. وعلى ما ورد منه أي من القصص. And upon those authentic hadith narrated about them, about the stories. Okay, that's fine. So what's more to be said about stories? I touched earlier on the use of biblical sources or other type of documents and narrations which might be accessed today. I mean, so the discussion about Israeliyat and the use of them would be too extensive for now, but Mufassirin often did make use of them. And in a way, what happened is they would come to the story in the Quran which is somehow lacking in detail, right? And that's, they understand that's the Quranic style. But then they, as a Mufassir, are sitting down to explain. So once they start to explain, they need to fill in certain gaps, right? It's natural. It's the problem of sitting down and writing a tafsir, right? It's just an upshot of the genre, right? So you're going to have to fill in some of those gaps in order to claim that you've explained anything, right? So when you do that, where do you draw those sources from? There are riwayat from the Salaf, and the fact is a great deal of that will be in reality from Judeo-Christian sources. They are Israeliyat. Or you could actually refer to the Bible itself, for example, to do a comparison and to grasp something about the context in which the Quran is speaking. And not many of the Mufassirin in classical times did that in that way, right? Al-Biqa'i is a notable example of that. But apart from that, for the most part, they did not refer to the Bible. They would go on much more second-hand, third-hand sources. And the Israeliyat themselves are oral tellings of things that might have their origin in the Bible, might be from outside the Bible, and it's not very clear, necessarily where they stemmed from, right? That's the kind of research that you can do. You can do it now and try to trace where did they come from. That's more and more something which people are doing. We have to grasp the fact that the Quran is speaking against a backdrop of prior knowledge, particularly when it's speaking to the Jews and Christians. And as such, it is actually quite legitimate to think, well, what is it that the Jews and Christians were supposed to understand here when the Quran was speaking to them? What is it that they knew about? What is the Quran actually addressing, correcting, building on, reinterpreting, presenting in a new way? In order to understand that, you need that background. So in that way, it is useful to dip into the sources, bearing in mind that the Quran is not necessarily concerned with only the Bible as such, right? So it's a lot to do with what was circulating, what were the understandings, doctrines, misunderstandings that existed at the time, and perhaps in a more timeless way, as part of the miracle of the Quran, the ongoing miracle of the Quran, that it would continue to address these matters in new ways as people investigate the Quran in new ways. Right? So that's an argument that can be made for the current time. There are things which are coming to light in terms of how the Quran addresses and challenges certain notions of documents that we were not aware existed, and which may have been around at the time of revelation, or things that maybe even are being addressed now in a different way. So there's a whole lot that can be looked into here in terms of usul. This is why I'm saying this is what I'm saying when I say that usul al-tafsir remains in a state of needing a lot of development. Qasas al-Quran is one of the fields that requires its own attention, right? And not just the qasas that pertain to Jews and Christians, but the qasas in general, how we understand certain things. For example, how do we deal with the fact that the same event is told in multiple surahs in different ways, right? So there could be a slightly different wording, Musa alayhi salam, what he said here in this surah, what he said in that surah. How do we understand this? And not just in the sense of how do we resolve the contradiction, right? Or drive off the shubha or the accusation that there's a contradiction. That's one reasonable task, okay? But more a case of, okay, what does that tell us about the nature of these qasas? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has related what Musa said here in those words, and he's related what he said in those words. What does that tell us about the nature of what he is relating, right? Is he relating the exact words that were said? Bearing in mind that there's already a kind of quote-unquote translation process necessarily because Musa alayhi salam was not speaking Arabic. So when we are told something in the Arabic Quran, how does that relate to the actual words that were spoken by Musa? How does it relate to what was in the hearts of the speakers and their inner intentions? How do you get from normal everyday speech that people were speaking to kalam al-mu'jiz in the Quran? Right? So there's various types of usul that require more elaboration, investigation. And I'm not saying that they haven't been thought about. What I'm saying is there still remains to collect these masail and these debates and make them into something more holistic that then provides a basis for dealing with these things. Okay, so we'll move on to what he says about at-tasawwuf.
وأما التصوف فله تعلق بالقرآن لما ورد في القرآن من المعارف الإلهية ورياضة النفوس وتنوير القلوب وتطهيرها باكتساب الأخلاق الحميدة واجتناب الأخلاق الذميمة. وقد تكلمت المتصوفة في تفسير القرآن، فمنهم من أحسن وأجاد ووصل بنور بصيرته إلى دقائق المعاني ووقف على حقيقة المراد، ومنهم من توغل في الباطنية وحمل القرآن على ما لا تقتضيه اللغة العربية.
His tone changed completely to a very disapproving one there. Okay, so this translation is also quite nice up until this point. And arrived by the light of the inner sight to the finest of meanings and applied themselves. So I wouldn't say applied themselves. They arrived at the reality of what was intended. Let's say that. ووقف على حقيقة المراد. of them, of them. So you would say there are others who press deeply into esotericism, okay, al-batiniya, right, which is to say a kind of extreme position where nothing in the Quran is actually as it appears to mean, right? So the zahir is never murad, but is always something batin, which is intended. And only a special select elite of people would have access to that batin, right? Because it's not for everyone to go and learn the Arabic language and then have access to the ma'ani batina, right? But rather you would have to have a special appointment from God. You have to be one of the infallible imams or whatever the sort of doctrine that surrounds batiniya may be. So you see here that crucially, it is the Arabic language which is the decider as to whether a meaning is going to be accepted or not, right? Is he referring to the sect? He's referring to the bataniya, which is a word which is used for certain sects, so especially the Ismailis, right? So when he talks, I don't know if he talks about Sheikh Ghazali, he doesn't. But yes, famously, Imam Ghazali has faced these types head on, and he has his book on Fada'ih al-Batiniya, and he's spoken about those who and I've got a small translation as well that I did of part of his Ihya where he talks about this. Tafsir bil Ra'i, right? Tafsir bil Ra'i in reality is not just speaking about tafsir without narrations, right? Because he specifically goes out to refute that. He says, no, tafsir bil Ra'i, the thing that is disapproved and dispraised by the Prophet ﷺ and by the Salaf is a number of things, and one of those is to just say things according to desires, or to say things according to an imposed understanding on the text which can't be supported by the Arabic language, right? So then he speaks about something which is close to that, and this is called التفسير الإشاري.
وقد جمع أبو عبد الرحمن السلمي كلامهم في التفسير في كتاب سماه الحقائق، وقال بعض العلماء بل هو البواطل، وإذا أنصفنا قلنا فيه حقائق وبواطل. وقد ذكرنا في هذا الكتاب ما يستحسن من الإشارات الصوفية دون ما يعترض أو يقدح فيه، وتكلمنا أيضا على 12 مقاما من مقامات التصوف في مواضعها من القرآن.
Okay, so we want the word isharat. We want to include that in. I would tend to use the word allusions, not illusions, but allusions. I think I will change it. Right. Okay. Yes. So this require issue, you've flagged that up with me. Yes. Which the Arabic language does not denote, something like this. Okay. So iqtida here is denotation. In fact, so in this particular context, I think there's another way of translating it, which the Arabic language does not provide. Right, you can see what kind of translator I am. I'm very context-based. Now, yes, it's good to have a sort of one-to-one correspondence. Iqtida is denotation. Iqtida is denotation. It's good to have that as an asl, right, as a basis and a default. But every time you see the word being used, think about it, like, how is it going to sound? And is there a better way of putting it according to the meaning that's intended here? In some types of translation, consistency between every use of iqtida might be very important. If your book is called al-iqtida fil Quran al-Kareem or something like this, then yeah, that's your thing. You have to really be very consistent here. In fact, you should just use the word iqtida and transliterate it, and then explain what you need to explain. But if you're talking about other things, then these things should should become flexible to the need, right? This is my method in translation. So yeah, someone suggested allow, that would be fine, does not allow. But I think provide is a good way of putting it, right? So Sufic allusions. Give me a moment, please. So Sufic allusions, isharat. So Sufi commentary could refer to a few different things, but isharat, you know, he's not really as such talking about isharat in the sense of what we call tafsir ishari. Tafsir ishari is something which is fairly close to kind of batini reading, but is not necessarily as problematic, right? Batini reading is a sort of claim that only the elite have access to the true meaning of the Quran, right? And as for the surface meanings that the ordinary people out there, right, the awam, are talking about, this is actually not this is not the real Quran. You know, this is just a zahir. They're ahlul zahir. Leave them to their superficialities, right? As for us, we have, because our imam has got this special access, only he can interpret the Quran for us. You see how this is like completely against, you know, at the very least, of Sunni Islam, right? But the notion of accessibility of the text is fundamental, right? The communicative nature of the text. I mean, there may be some tendencies sometimes even amongst mainstream Muslims to sometimes talk, you know, as if you have to go through an imam, small I, right? Only they can tell you what the Quran means. You can't understand it by yourself. And sometimes when I've been sort of campaigning against some of these ideas, people have said, oh, you know, look at these very Protestant ideas. Subhanallah. All I'm saying is, you know, the Quran is for everybody, and then you're calling me a Protestant, you know, dragging in a debate between factions of a different religion. You know, let's stick to our own terms. You know, if you're saying that it's only an elite can read it, then you know, we've got another set of problems. Right. So we have mentioned those Sufic allusions which are regarded as good in this book, but not those which are objected to or censured. Okay. دون ما يعترض أو يقدح فيه وتكلم. Okay. And then in addition to that, and we have spoken about it, what's this? I don't think there's a separate bit in the text which that corresponds to, right? But then he says, we have also spoken about 12 stations of tasawwuf. So these are just some key concepts of tasawwuf, of practical spirituality, of the concepts of spirituality, which, all right, give me another moment. So he's talked here about a number of different stations or different general concepts in tasawwuf, which he's then linked to particular ayat. You know, so once that ayat comes up and it mentions a word, which is a key word, important to the practical path of spirituality and the experiences of the spiritual masters, then he will give a little elaboration, which is pleasant to read and to find. We've come across some of them already, and here he's giving us the list of where he has mentioned each one.
فتكلمنا على الشكر في القرآن لما بين الحمد والشكر من الاشتراك في المعنى، وتكلمنا على التقوى في قوله تعالى في البقرة هدى للمتقين، وعلى الذكر في قوله فيها فاذكروني أذكركم، وعلى الصبر في قوله تعالى فيها وبشر الصابرين. وعلى التوحيد في قوله فيها وإلهكم إله واحد، وعلى محبة الله في قوله فيها والذين آمنوا أشد حبا لله، وعلى التوكل في قوله في آل عمران فإذا عزمت فتوكل على الله، وعلى المراقبة في قوله في النساء إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا، وعلى الخوف والرجاء في قوله في الأعراف وادعوه خوفا وطمعا، وعلى التوبة في قوله في النور وتوبوا إلى الله جميعا، وعلى الإخلاص في قوله في لم يكن وما أمروا إلا ليعبدوا الله مخلصين له الدين.
Okay, so you see that he actually named Surah Al-Bayyinah in a different way. He called it Lam Yakun, which I don't mind that they've translated it as Al-Bayyinah, to be honest, or just in terms of making it straightforward. But as you saw earlier, there was a sort of awkward way that they talked about surahs that were named by a word within it. Okay, so the last thing to say about Tafsir Ishari is that we do find that some of the ulama approve this kind of approach, but what they want to say is, in addition to the intended meaning, which is the surface or close to the surface, right? So that is to say, yes, there may be majaz and so on, but there are still things which are given by the language as such. Then there are insights, which is not that dissimilar to what we might say is, we often talk about tadabbur, right? So that the people of spiritual practice and those riyadatun nafs, and they might read the ayah and have just a completely different kind of take on it, which they're not saying is the meaning, and they're not saying it's the murad. They're just saying that there's a level on which this ayah can be appreciated other than the tafsir, right? So it's easier when you call this isharat and you don't call it tafsir, even tafsir ishari, right? It's preferable to think of it as not tafsir. And that's a position that some of the ulama, like if you see Dr. Dhahabi in Tafsir al-Mufassirun, he takes this kind of middle position between the two things. If you look at the tafsir of Al-Alusi, Ruh al-Ma'ani, which I'm sure is behind, which one is it? This one here, okay? Tafsir Ruh al-Ma'ani. Al-Alusi includes a section on ishara after each passage of a page or so of ayat, and you can open up and have a look, and when you look at it you will say, what is this, right? And what relation does it have actually to tafsir? It hardly has any relation to what was said before it. Very exact and analytical approach to tafsir is found in the main part of the tafsir, and then he's bracketed off this other discussion. And I would just give him credit for having bracketed it off, right? Al-Fadl ibn Ashur, rahmatullah alayhi, when he's commenting on it, he just said, I wish that Al-Alusi had not included this at all. All it does is open a door to Bataniya, right? I'm paraphrasing him here. But the fact that he's bracketed it off means that we can treat it as a separate phenomenon, and we can ignore it altogether if we so wish. Okay. So then he's going to talk about Usul al-Din and Usul al-Fiqh and a few other things. We'll see what we can cover.
وأما أصول الدين فتتعلق بالقرآن من طريقين.
So you first have to understand what Usul al-Din is. Usul al-Din refers to creed and theology, right? So those are, I studied in Kulliyat Usul al-Din fil Azhar, right? And across the other, just across this little street within the campus, we had got Kulliyat al-Sharia. And most of my colleagues from the West go there to study in Kulliyat Sharia. A few in Usul al-Din, very few. Some in Kulliyat al-Dirasat al-Arabiya wal-Islamiyya, which has a broader syllabus even than ours. But in Kulliyat Sharia, they would do fiqh and Usul al-Fiqh almost exclusively, right? A few other things besides. And I would always joke with them and say, we are Kulliyat Usul al-Din and you are Kulliyat Furu' al-Din, right? So you are the branches of the religion. Because of course the usul of everything are the beliefs, right? The aqaid and tawheed and everything, right? So that's what's intended here by Usul al-Din.
ما ورد في القرآن من إثبات العقائد وإقامة البراهين عليها والرد على أصناف الكفار. والآخر أن الطوائف المختلفة من المسلمين تعلقوا بالقرآن، وكل طائفة منهم تحتج لمذهبها بالقرآن وترد على من خالفها وتزعم أنه خالف القرآن، ولا شك أن منهم المحق والمبطل. فمعرفة تفسير القرآن توصل في ذلك إلى التحقيق مع التسديد والتأييد من الله والتوفيق.
Okay. Now, so there's two aspects of relevance of Usul al-Din to Tafsir. One is extracting Usul al-Din from the statements of the Quran. Okay, so the best Aqidah is, of course, the Quran itself and what the Quran provides. Okay, so that's one. And the other is that the Quran is, becomes evidence for different aqa'id, right? Both the true and the false among them, right? So we have these books, for example, the Mu'tazila are the first who wrote these books called Mutashabihul Quran. And by Mutashabih here, they mean the ayat, which in contrast to the Muhkamat, right? So those which require interpretation. So then they would include all the ayat which Ahl Sunnah consider Muhkamat, and they would call them Mutashabihat. Ahl Sunnah, on the other hand, basically one man's Muhkam is another man's Mutashabih, in short, right? So there's a bunch of discussion could be had around it, but what we mean to say is here that just because something is based on the Quran doesn't mean it's automatically accepted. Rather, it's the method of istidlal, how it's used as proof, and what we consider to be the foundational ayat in the Quran, which everything has to be referred back to. So, for example, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. That is considered probably by everyone as foundational, even if there's argumentation between those who want to affirm certain attributes for Allah and those who want to say, well, those are not actually attributes of Allah, they are actions of Allah, or they are metaphorically interpreted rather than taken on face value. Pun ever so slightly intended when I say face value. So the point is that both of those groups in reality consider Laysa kamithlihi shay as a foundational text, but they just apply that in slightly different ways. So the point here is that each group wants to use it. وَتَرُدُّ مَنْ خَالَفَهَا وَتَزْعَمُ أَنَّهُ خَالَفَ القرآن. Okay, so what do we need? معرفة تفسير القرآن توصل في ذلك إلى التحقيق. Okay, so the tafsir should help us to resolve these questions. The result that you will be made to arrive at a precise determination. And this is not too bad, but I would probably reword this a little bit. But the Quran should be the hujjah, and it should be the thing that allows us to unite upon what is correct. And then with that, you require Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to support you. So I think this translation sort of obscures that last point. Along with strengthening, his point is that it's not just by your own efforts, but it requires the strengthening and aid and granting of success from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so we could go on a little bit. Amma usul al-fiqh. I touched on this a little bit earlier.
وأما أصول الفقه فإنها من أدوات تفسير القرآن، على أن كثيرا من المفسرين لم يشتغلوا بها، وإنها لنعم العون على فهم المعاني وترجيح الأقوال. وما أحوج المفسر إلى معرفة النص والظاهر والمجمل والمبين والعام والخاص والمطلق والمقيد وفحوى الخطاب ولحن الخطاب ودليل الخطاب وشروط النسخ ووجوه التعارض وأسباب الخلاف وغير ذلك من علم الأصول.
Okay. How urgently is a bit slightly strange. So he makes an interesting observation here. Many commentators have not occupied themselves with usul al-fiqh. It's an intriguing statement. I'm not entirely sure how, what he means by that, or how it can be substantiated. But it looks at something to investigate. There is a recent book by Dr. Fahd al-Wahbi, which is what's it called? المسائل المشتركة بين أصول الفقه وعلوم القرآن, or he might have said it in the other order. And he looks at the books of Ulum al-Quran and the books of Usul al-Fiqh and sees the things that they're talking about, how many of them actually overlap, and where there is some things in Usul al-Fiqh that are relevant but not mentioned in the books of Ulum al-Quran, and vice versa, some things that are mentioned in Ulum al-Quran which are relevant to Usul al-Fiqh but not mentioned in those books. It's a very interesting survey. So then there are different types of text within the Quran, different types of statement. نص ظاهر مجمل, well, not مبين but مبين or مبين. So then it's not distinguishing. Our text has got مبين, مجمل ومبين. So that would be the right reading. And then you got عام, خاص. Okay, these are doubled. مطلق, مقيد. So I have maybe some favored terms of how to translate these things. I speak about these concepts in my thesis in chapter 4. In particular, I talk about juristic methods in Tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran. So where we have different parts of the Quran, some of them are mujmal, and then other things are bayan of it. And we have khas and am and khas, and we have takhsis, the process of making something more particular or limiting a universal set. And you have mutlaq, unrestricted, and muqayyad, right? So we have a restricting clause, qaid, and then you have hamdul mutlaq al muqayyad. And so there are some things that I discussed there. Fahul khitab, lahl khitab. Okay, so I want to, over-examine these translations for now. Asbab al-khilaf is also within Usul al-Fiqh, which is going to be touched on. He's going to talk about reasons for difference in tafsir, right, in a subsequent bab.
اللغة فلا بد للمفسر من حفظ ما ورد في القرآن منها.
So he's gone on to lugha there, other things of the knowledge of principles of jurisprudence, right? So lots of times when they talk about usul, they just al-usul, they mean usul al-fiqh. So then lugha, language, and they've used language and usage. I'm just going to highlight it, not that it's wrong, but it's actually quite interesting because it is about the lexicon of the Arabic language.
غريب القرآن وهي فن من فنون التفسير. وقد صنف الناس في غريب القرآن تصانيف كثيرة، وقد ذكرنا بعد هذه المقدمة مقدمة في اللغات الكثيرة الدوران في القرآن لئلا نحتاج أن نذكرها حيثما وقعت فيطول الكتاب بكثرة تكرارها. Okay, so we probably touched on the concept of lugha before when I was talking about his muqaddimah, and we talked about some things related to the meaning of words and also the multiple meanings of a single word, which is studied within wujuh al-nadha'ir. And his lughat section reflects some of that, richness and diversity of the usages of certain words. So a mufassir has to know the meanings of words. Otherwise, how is he or she going to do this business of tafsir? So that's what we call gharib al-Quran. Gharib al-Quran is a little bit sort of more specific sounding. A broader sense would be mufradat al-Quran. Raghib al-Asfahani's book kind of combines these two things. It's called, what is it called? Al-Gharib min Mufradat al-Quran. So sometimes it's published as Mufradat al-Quran. So Gharib would be, of course, it sounds like it means strange, but it would just be something that's unfamiliar, right? So the less obvious words. You don't have to explain everything. But if you look at Raghib's book, which is one of the the core sources in this field, you would find lots of things there that probably aren't very difficult or very hard to understand, very well-known words. Okay. So he's not going into examples of who's written on that. But of course, Raghib is one. And then
there's a book which is based on his work, which is by As-Samin al-Halabi, which is called Umdatul Huffaz. So it's a sort of more extensive version of Ar-Raghib's lexicon.
وأما النحو فلا بد للمفسر من معرفته، فإن القرآن نزل بلسان العرب فيحتاج إلى علم اللسان. والنحو ينقسم قسمين، أحدهما عوامل الإعراب وهي أحكام الكلام المركب، والآخر التصريف وهو أحكام الكلمات قبل تركيبها.
Right, so typically, Nahu is distinguished from Sarf or Tasrif, as he says here. But here he's using the word Nahu as a broader term, which then contains I'rab and Tasrif. Okay, so elements of inflection. So Awamil would be agents. Okay, agents of inflection. So the things that cause words to be marfu or mansub or majroor, or in verbs you've got raf and nasb and jazm, right? So these are awamil al-i'rab. There could be specific syntactical functions. There could be instruments and words and particles and so on, right? So these are all the things that affect the i'rab of a word and of a sentence. But then the word, before it starts to become mu'arab, before we look at the ending of the word, there's the structure of the word itself. So that's tasrif. Okay. We mentioned this book on inflection that is in the Quran, that which is needed, of the unclear, and that which is disagreed about.
ذكرنا في هذا الكتاب من إعراب القرآن ما يحتاج إليه من المشكل أو المختلف فيه أو ما يفيد فهم المعنى أو يختلف المعنى باختلافه، ولم نتعرض لما سوى ذلك من الإعراب السهل الذي لا يحتاج إليه إلا المبتدئ، فإن ذلك تطويل بغير كبير فائدة.
Okay, so he doesn't do i'rab of the whole Quran, but wherever there is a fa'idah in mentioning, right? So that could be because there's something tricky. I use the word tricky for mushkil sometimes. And where there's different opinions about the i'rab, where talking about the i'rab will help to clarify the meaning, or where the multiple i'rabs have an effect on different possible meanings of the ayah. Okay, but as for something straightforward, agreed upon, you can find it elsewhere if you really need it. But you notice something that people would, does this tell you something about whether his book is for a mubtadi' or not? لا يحتاج إليه إلا المبتدئ. So the beginner is not expected to be reading this book. But there could be a beginner in tafsir, but not a beginner in nahu, right? So he's expecting you to come with a certain background in nahu, right? Yunus is asking me about hifz when he says فلا بد من حفظ ما ورد في القرآن منها. I would think that he really does mean memorize. I mean, this should be at the readiness and at the fingertips of the mufassir. You should not have to figure out what words mean or look them up, right?
وأما علم البيان فهو علم شريف تظهر به فصاحة القرآن، وقد ذكرنا منه في هذا الكتاب فوائد فائقة ونكتا مستحسنة رائقة، وجعلنا في المقدمات بابا في أدوات البيان ليفهم به ما يرد منها مفرقا في مواضع من القرآن.
Okay, so likewise, this is going to be something he comes back to. Ilm al-Bayan is, typically within Ilm al-Balagha, we have Bayan and Ma'ani and Badi', right? So yeah, he probably is referring to that subcategory. I mean, I think we can take it in that way, because he is talking about how images and how comparisons are expressed, right? So this is one of the key things that Zamakhshari has brought into the field of tafsir in a very big way, right? So this being a book that draws from Zamakhshari naturally draws from those benefits. A noble science by which the eloquence of the Quran becomes clear, becomes manifest, right? Somebody wanted the word manifest last time, we'll use it this time, right? For tadhhar. We mention outstanding benefits of it in this book and points which are clear and pleasurable. مستحسنة رائقة. It's kind of not a very direct translation anyway. We have placed a chapter on the instruments of rhetoric in the introductions in order that that which occurs in different places of Quran may be understood.